Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore virtual events. I'm Elizabeth, the events coordinator, and I am joined this evening by K Woodman-Maynard and Virginia Macgregor while we celebrate her new release of The Great Gatsby, a graphic novelization. These books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. We got our books. We actually sold all of our, we sent out all of our signed book plates, and we have more on the way to you, actually, and then you'll send them back. We're going to send out more. We're very pleased about this. If you are watching this event live, please click around and find the chat sidebar where you can send well wishes, questions. Please do send in your questions throughout the event. We will be asking them in the later half of the event. But right now, I am very pleased to introduce this event. Former Concord resident K Woodman-Maynard visiting Gibson's Bookstore virtually for The Great Gatsby. She is in conversation with Concord novelist Virginia Macgregor. They have known each other for a little while. They're here to discuss Catherine's event. Virginia, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much for having us, Elizabeth. And this is just such an honor. I remember a while ago, I took a walk when Catherine was still here with her through kind of the Concord woods, and we talked about the projects we were both working on, and she gave me a little insight into the fact that she was working on Gatsby. And it's a novel that I have read and reread and taught so many times, and I was just beyond excited because the narrative is so visual, and I just was thrilled that someone was turning it into a graphic novel. I only regretted that I wasn't still a teacher so that I could use it as a wonderful resource with students. And as time went on, Catherine sent me little glimpses, little snapshots of the pictures, and they were just so beautiful. And then, a few weeks ago, I finally got my hard copy, and my children have been looking at the pictures. My husband, the other day, I made the mistake of giving it to him at dinner, and we were meant to be, watching the kids and preventing them from throwing food at each other and that sort of thing. And he was like nose in the book and couldn't stop turning the pages. And it is truly gorgeous and has just surpassed, my hopes and dreams and expectations for, an adaptation of an absolute classic and one that is so loved. And Catherine's work is just, if you're familiar with it, it's just beautiful. It's original. It's fresh, it's inspiring, it's both classic and feels modern at the same time. And it's a real honor to speak to her tonight. I think Catherine's going to introduce herself a little bit and is then going to give us a reading, share a little bit of the book with you that she loves. And then we'll kick off and I'll start asking her some questions, and hopefully we'll have a wonderful conversation. And then after that, you can join in with your own questions, so do be thinking of those. So Catherine, do give us an introduction to, how this wonderful book came into being.
Sure, thank you so much, Virginia. That's such a nice introduction. I want to first introduce you though a little bit. So Virginia is a novelist, and you've written 7 more? How many
yeah, my 7th is coming out.
7th is coming out. And I've had the honor of doing a map for the inside cover of The Children's Secret, which is coming out this summer, and I also got to read it. So definitely keep an eye out for that, because it is a very good story. I couldn't put it down. It was the most page turner that I've read for quite a while. So I want you guys to check out Virginia's books too. But regarding The Great Gatsby, I, maybe 9 years ago, I was living in San Francisco, and I was talking to a friend, Emily Parker, about, graphic novels, and we kind of threw around the idea of adapting Gatsby into a modern day story set in San Francisco. And we just spent, maybe a couple hours on it. It didn't really go anywhere. And then, maybe 3 years ago, I had finished 2 graphic novels that were fiction, YA, fantasy adventures, and I'd submitted those to publishers, and they hadn't found a publisher. And then I thought I wanted to do something a little different, and I've always loved The Great Gatsby so much, and so that kind of came to mind. And luckily, I looked into whether it was in the public domain or not, and I found out that it was coming into the public domain in January of 2021, which was quite good timing, because it takes about a year to complete a novel and then another year to get it manufactured and shipped back. And so I kind of just made it time-wise, in terms of I got a new agent who successfully sold it to Candlewick Press, which has been an amazing publisher to work with, and they really did a beautiful, beautiful job. And so that is kind of how it came to be. But I want to maybe just read you guys the first 10 pages and I'm going to screen share with you so you can see it, which is actually a really wonderful thing about the virtual format. So just bear with me a second as I do that. Are you able to see that, Virginia?
Yep, I can see that really well. It's beautiful.
Great. So, The Great Gatsby, a graphic novel adaptation by K Woodman-Maynard, based on the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Here's the title page. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. After the war, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. Since I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, I took a house in the country. It was next to Gatsby's mansion. Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. 20 miles from New York City, a pair of enormous eggs juts out into Long Island Sound. I lived in West Egg, the less fashionable of the two. The history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over to East Egg to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Why they came east, I don't know. They drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. Daisy was my second cousin, and I know Tom at Yale, old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Tom had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. I've got a nice place here. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. He was one of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family was enormously wealthy. Even as a college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. Let's go find Daisy. Two women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. It was as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. Boom. Nick, I'm paralyzed with happiness. How was your trip east? I stopped off in Chicago for a day. Dozens of friends send their love. Do they miss me? The whole town is desolate. There's a persistent wail of mourning all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. I'm stiff. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow. Jordan Baker was a famous golfer. I'd heard a story about her, something unpleasant, but I'd forgotten it long ago. You live in West Egg. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? What Gatsby? It's time for dinner. And then that's all I'm going to read right now. But I realized that Virginia and I know The Great Gatsby so well that we forget that some people might not be as familiar with it as we are. So I just want to give a little summary about it. And so it is about Nick Carraway, who's a young man who returns after the war, and he's a Minnesotan, and he goes out to New York, and he ends up taking a little house next to Gatsby's mansion, and Jay Gatsby is this mysterious figure who's enormously wealthy and throws these huge parties, and it turns out he is in love with Nick's cousin, Daisy Buchanan, who's a socialite and married to Tom Buchanan, and they have a daughter together. So the story is sort of about Gatsby trying to win her back and their kind of doomed affair and obsession, and a lot about class and power, all set in the 1920s. And of course, it's by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So that's kind of my summary.
Super. I think, the first question I had when reading it was how incredibly well, and when you were reading it there, it just showed up again, how well it flowed and how the narrative just seemed to, to flow as naturally as the original. And yet, obviously, you've had to cut so many words. And, as someone who's constantly cutting words for my own work, and also someone who loves The Great Gatsby, I just don't know how you would begin to go about that. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that process of taking this, this beautiful long book and then choosing just the right bits to create a narrative that flows, that isn't kind of jolty. And also, maybe tell us, did the images come first? Did the words come first? What's your process there? How hard was it to select? That would be a wonderful insight.
Yeah, I'm just going to pull up what I have about my process, but let me just share the screen. Not that share button. Sorry. So this is my work process, but really, I mean, where it really starts is with the book. Yeah. And I had my high school edition that was actually my sister's first with her notes in it, and then my notes in it. And I reread that, and I was like, oh, this could totally work as an adaptation. Like, I was blown away by the metaphors, which I'll talk about later. But the first thing I did was order another copy.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I really didn't want to be influenced by my 16-year-old observation. And so what I did is I just went through and, just really actively like underlined and made notes and looking especially for visual cues, because I wanted, visual details, color, repetition of different imagery like the moon or sun or just various things that would be particularly good visually. And then underlining the phrases that I felt like were particularly important. But in terms of the flow, I work in this way, which I think as a novelist, you're probably is kind of a very different way, but I think about it page by page. So this is an overview of a chapter, and these drawings are about this high, and each of these are page spreads. So I'm laying it out and playing around with the pacing. So like this page is the upper left one. And that's how I get the flow down, and I'm marking in where text will be and where narration will be. And I play around with this a ton. Like the first version was only 155 pages, and the final version is 228 pages. So you can see how much I played with things and rearranged. And so that's, I think, how the flow ends up kind of coming together.
Wow, that's fascinating.
If you want me to walk you through the different stages, I'll just do it pretty quickly because
yeah, do absolutely.
Yeah. So I then do a script so that I know what happens.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, on each page. And this script is pretty detailed. I don't do as detailed scripts now. This would be more the type you would give if I was not the artist, if I was the writer, and I would give it to an artist. But it's saying panel by panel what would happen. And then I just fold an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper together, grab a blue pencil just because I like it and it doesn't smear, and I draw it out. And it's very rough. I mean, this is like a 3-minute drawing just to get the feeling of it out. And then I go on the computer, and in Clip Studio Paint, which is just a kind of cartooning program, I draw it out with my Cintiq drawing tablet, which I can see what I'm drawing on the screen. And again, it's still pretty rough. And I end up, this is what I send to my editors, the pencils is what they're called. And then they make edits, and I revise my pencils. And so this is so that I don't spend a huge amount of time on something that then they say, this doesn't work. So from there, I go on to inking, which is essentially tracing over my pencils in much cleaner lines. And this is an example like of taking details from the text. So there's this great line in the text about they have this dinner party, and it says, among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet avoid all eyes. And so you can kind of see the you know, the eyes in the broken fragments of the dinner party. And so those are things I'm trying, like, I'm not going to write that out, but I'm trying to figure out how to convey it visually. And that was essentially the whole project, was trying to figure out how to visually convey things instead of using words, but which is really hard because Fitzgerald's worlds are so beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. And it really strikes me that, you know, I think for those of us who aren't as familiar with the process of creating a graphic novel, I love that you seem to work in both an analog and a digital form. Is that something that's very important to you? And does that differ from graphic artist to graphic artist? You know, do you deliberately try to use, you know, your hands and paper as well as using the computer?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody is different. Like, I don't think anybody does their process just like I do it. You know, we all have our own ways of working. Some people are entirely digital. I think most people do some sort of combination. I really like doing the penciling stage on the computer because I work by moving things. Like, I'm kind of a trial and error person. Like, so I'm like, oh, that doesn't work. And then I can easily move it around and erase, and that gets really messy by hand. I also digitally inked it, but I hated that. And so on my current book, I am doing it analog.
Oh, interesting. You didn't like that, right?
I did not. It was just, you know, so much time on the computer. And then the final stage, though, is watercolor. And so I print out these inks onto watercolor paper.
Wow.
And then I, you know, take out my paint and watercolor it.
And connected to that, you know, one of the things that struck me most when reading your book, and I don't know if is reading the right term when you look at a graphic novel, I guess reading can be visual as well as words, was just your extraordinary use of color. I mean, you know, there are some pages that are completely one color, or a particular tone. Some are all red. There are some that then go into black and white. They're the romantic ones that feel like they're more in kind of pinks and purples. And Gatsby, Fitzgerald himself uses color as this really powerful motif, I think, to evoke mood and atmosphere in the book. And that's something that just stands out from your book, you know, in your own book, and the watercoloring you did. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the thinking behind your use of color.
Yeah, let me just share the screen again. Yeah, that is one of the reasons I wanted to adapt it, was because of the use of colors. So, you know, it's so beautiful. But I also had never done watercolor before. One of my friends who's a cartoonist suggested that I try watercolor because it fit the story, kind of the booziness, the like magicalness, the, you know, just kind of the vibe. And I agreed, but I had to learn how to do it. And so this is actually like the first time I tried watercoloring this page. So this is what it became. Wow. And this was the very early version, but I didn't like it, but I knew that there was the potential there. Yeah. And so one of the things, because of my lack of experience, I ended up doing a very limited color palette. So this is actually the whole color palette on the lower left. And those are the only colors I gave myself. And I would try to do 2 or 3 colors a page. And this was really just somewhat so that I could meet my deadline. But I also really like limited color palettes. I think they're very striking, but they're also easier to work with. But what was really challenging was that some pages, Fitzgerald is so specific about the colors, like myrtle,
like yellow
brown dress. And I'm like, I don't have brown, you know? And so I wouldn't be able to be literal to the thing. And I would be like, well, it's a dull colored dress. And so that would maybe be blue in my story or whatever, you know, like I'd have to kind of, like, I don't have silver with, like, I think they describes as Gatsby's wearing like a silver tie or a gold tie. And so there are things like that where I know that there was a good reason for those color choices that Fitzgerald did, but I didn't have them in my story and I didn't want to, like, you know, change them. But then there were certain pages, like Gatsby's car always had to be gold. So I had to, like, always work the color palette around that. And gold with green seats.
That just
so,
aesthetically.
I can find it. Yeah. So this is like where I had to do, like, just try to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
Visually.
Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, I love that. And I guess connected to that, spinning off from that question of color is, how did you balance that sense of staying faithful to the original and also to the era, and also having a bit of creative license and making it very much your own? And like I said, when I look at your book, I love that it feels fresh and modern and contemporary, but it also feels very much of its time and classic. And how did you balance those two things?
Yeah, well, I really tried to prioritize the graphic novel medium over being like literal to the book.
Right.
And so I really want to make a graphic novel that I thought was good.
Yeah.
And I don't like graphic novels that are very dense with text. I feel like I want everybody to read the Great Gatsby prose book. I don't need to, put all the prose that I can jam into my graphic novel. And so it was really just choosing the lines that I thought were the most important, what moved the story forward. But then there were things that I took artistic license with, like Daisy's hair color in the book is described as brown. I couldn't picture Daisy as brown.
No, I can never picture. I didn't even remember that. When you said that, I thought, gosh, I don't think I've ever pictured her as having brown hair.
Yeah. Neither have any of the film adaptations. So like things like that, but there were a lot of little decisions like that. Like certainly Wolfsheim, who's described as very very caricature of like a Jewish gangster, and I was not comfortable with such an anti-Semitic interpretation. And so like I wanted him to be intimidating, but I wasn't gonna draw him with luxuriating nose hairs, which is how he's described in the book. So that was like one change. We also changed some of his text to be less stereotypical. Like he has this famous line about like, I want to make a connection for you, Nick. And it's like, it's supposed to be connection. So we modernized some of the language, like especially accents. And we also, like I did some things with placement. So like Owl Eyes, I had the car accident during Gatsby's party that I ended Gatsby's party with that accident. That doesn't happen in the book, but I felt like that was a better beat from a storytelling perspective. I did that in a couple places, and I invented some little scene when Tom goes to Gatsby's house, because I felt like I just needed to explain why Tom was suddenly at Gatsby's house. It wasn't pertinent to the story. So it was kind of like trying to stay true to the story, while, balancing being a good graphic novel, modernizing.
Yeah. Well, I think you struck that balance just perfectly. And another question that's similar to that is, one of the things I love most about this book is that you are able to bring to life some of the metaphors which then spin into the slightly surreal. And, I think you shared with us that picture of, Jordan and Daisy kind of floating almost like balloons off the sofa. Oh, they look like gymnasts. And that, when you drew that picture, and I saw it for the first time, I think that was one of the first ones you shared with me when you were in the process of making it. It felt like that's how I saw it in my head, because it was billowy and light, and and such a contrast to this harshness and brutality of Tom Buchanan. And I love that you brought to life that metaphor and you pushed it even further. Tell us a bit about that. That seems very much your signature.
Yeah, well, when I started rereading the book and was thinking like maybe this would be good, I got to this point, and that's when I was like, I am doing this because I always think there needs to be a reason that it should be a graphic novel. And like the reason in this case is it's like, the characters don't need to be bound by gravity. They can be floating in the air. And it's really directly like the text is completely like the only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch upon which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I'm gonna skip ahead a little. And then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the caught wind died out of the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. So he uses like 2 paragraphs to describe this scene, which is probably as much text as maybe I use like in, half a chapter. So, I mean, and it's beautiful, but I just tried to take all these details and just show it in 2 pages. And I thought, I mean, and it's just them floating is so, Daisy's such an object of Gatsby's affection. She's kind of placed on a pedestal. I mean, women in that time period, and then they're kind of floating back down to earth. And so this was just so much fun to draw. I used reference photos of like ballerinas in swimming
Yes,
pools.
that's what it looks like. Oh, ballerinas in a swimming pool. Wow.
Yes. And then like their dresses were all like floating around, and so this is a really fun one to draw. But like the party scene, yeah, there was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and women and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. And so, I mean, it just was like, of course I'm going to put wings on the party guests.
Yes.
And then I have champagne floating around the party, and it's just very surreal. And I felt like it just suits the story. Like this would not suit every story, but I think for Gatsby, it really does. So that was.
Oh, I think Fitzgerald would love it. I think every book is the beginning of a conversation, and I love the life that you've brought to it. And it's just, it not only is it beautiful, but it just brings to life the language in a visual sense. That's really wonderful. And I suppose, connected to this idea of, the old and the new, and taking things, out of kind of the classical and updating it and so on. I remember about the time of the election, you shared on social media a quotation from the book that was really powerful. And I think this was the quotation, correct me if I'm wrong. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money and their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. And somehow I feel like, Gatsby speaks to our times today as much as he did to his own times, and somehow you've captured that sense of the romance and the lightness and the airiness, but also, the brutality of these rich, careless, callous, privileged people. And I wonder how much you had in your mind when you were writing this, thoughts about how Gatsby speaks to today, whether it be about, the privilege of these rich white people and how they smash everything up and are careless, or, as you said, the objectification of women and issues around gender, things, were you thinking about how it spoke to the moment, and did you want to incorporate that in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought a lot. I think class was the thing that I was focused on in the book over, instead of wealth or the American dream. Like class was really the thing that I was focused on. And I felt like, especially right now in our country, I think we see such a different divides of various kinds, but class is certainly one of them. And I think it's something that in the US, I don't think we're as comfortable talking about. And I certainly felt like, right around the election, this quote was going around, and I felt like, especially, it makes me think about climate change a lot, just kind of people going about their lives, not thinking about the consequences of their actions. And I think there is that very timeless element of that. And similarly, with the, women, it's not like, we're not objectified like Daisy was, and we have many more choices, but there's still so far to come.
And I think, even the whole Me Too movement, the way that Tom behaves with, whether he be his wife or his mistress, or, that I think it feels so alive today and so contemporary. And
how trapped Daisy was hard. Like I felt that a lot while working. Like I get so angry at her because she does some despicable things, but at the same time, I just wanted her to like leave Tom, leave Gatsby, go out on her own. But obviously for a woman of that era, that's not, even though flappers were gaining more freedoms, it wasn't like, that would be easy to do. So this this page was really, again, kind of a literal interpretation of what they left behind, and the detritus.
And so you said beautifully how you had this lovely old copy that you studied when you were at high school, and how your sister had studied it before you. I love that kind of passing on and overlaying. And I guess I wonder, you said you didn't want to be influenced by your 16-year-old reading of it. Do you feel that your reading of Gatsby changed coming back to it all this time later?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely did. Like, there were certain things that I completely missed, I think, in high school. Like, there's the scene with McGee, where Nick kind of, it seems like, hooks up with this photographer friend at one point in the book, and I totally missed, that in high school. And like, so there's some details like that, but I think one of the things was also how obsessive Gatsby was, that he's so beautiful and kind of attractive, and in his, like, his desire for Daisy, that he builds this whole, like, fantasy up, and he tries to hold parties so that she'll come. I mean, and it's so kind of infantile, but also so obsessive. Like, he opens a drawer and shows her all the clippings about her, and I'm just like, this is like a stalker. There is a word for this now. And and it's funny because I still find him fascinating, but I'm like, the judgmentalness kind of comes in. But
yeah, I mean, it's hard, isn't it, because you partly read it as a love story, and I wonder whether you see it as a love story or not.
I don't really see it as a love story. I see it more as obsession than love. And it makes me really angry, like when Gatsby describes to Nick how he and Daisy kind of hooked up back in the day. Like, he essentially tricked her into thinking that he could take care of her. And presumably if she got pregnant, and that makes me really angry as a woman, like that she was kind of tricked. So I get, I'm like Nick, I'm judgmental, just like.
So about Nick, I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks to any adaptation of Gatsby, whether it be film, stage, graphic novel, is, the book is seen through the lens of an unreliable narrator, which is partly what makes it so special. It's seen, for those of you less familiar with the book, it's told through the perspective of Nick Carraway, and he claims to be, unflinchingly honest. And yet we know from lots of things he says that actually he is unreliable. And so that adds a whole layer to our reading of it, because we're not quite sure what's ever true. In this world of fake news, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Building up a character like Gatsby, and, what is real about him, what isn't real, what's true, what's not. How did you see that as a stumbling block or an opportunity, having someone who is an unreliable narrator when you're trying to create a visual medium as well?
I found it kind of liberating. I was like, well, I can't trust Nick's words, so I'll interpret it how I want to interpret it. Yeah. But I did include some things in the book where I tried to, like, one scene in particular, Daisy and Gatsby are running off into the woods, presumably to hook up, and I have the narration be, we sat on the steps for a while and talked, or something, which is in the book, but it's so clearly not what's happening in the shot. And so I tried to, use that as a very direct way to highlight that he was being, that he wasn't telling the full truth. I also, in terms of shot type, there are many shots where it's like over his shoulder, like, really trying to emphasize that. But he was a character design that was very challenging to do too, because I wanted him to be, I don't know, like, kind of innocent, but, not super attractive, not unattractive, sort of middling. And this took a long time. My editor and creative director kept kind of pushing me to work on his character design. And I made him very thin too, because I felt like he's sort of swayed by the people he's around. He's just he kind of can work in different worlds, right? And so I wanted him to you know, he never dresses so well, but he's, you know, not totally underdressed. Like it's
just floats between the seams
yeah,
of the story, which is what makes him so useful, I guess.
Right. And in like stark contrast to well, Daisy is one, but Tom, this is like the early character design on the,
I wanted to punch him.
yeah, on the left, and you can see how he becomes a little bit more like suave, a little bit, you know, it's kind of an evolution of his character design, trying to make him very square and hulking. And so there's that, but I realize I'm going off.
And I think there's quite an interesting story I read that of how you came up with the design for Gatsby himself, because he's such an enigma. You know, everyone has an opinion about him. No one quite knows who he is. No one quite knows exactly what he looks like. And yet, you know, you create this beautiful, vivid picture of him in your novel. And I wonder how you came to your characterization of Gatsby.
Well, I realized that that's funny. In the presentation, I don't have any images of
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just laughing because I mean he does come into the story quite late, actually. He kind of has an odd introduction, but this is I guess I'll just hold up the page, but this is Gatsby right here. And so I always pictured him kind of classically attractive, and I was looking at images from the 1920s. And there was this one model that was used again and again, and he was the arrow shirt man, is kind of what he was known as. And I used him as a reference. And he, it turns out that there's a line in the book that Daisy says to Gatsby, "You look like that man in the advertisement. You know that man." And then I read later that scholars thought that it was the arrow shirt man.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's so random. So that's kind of, I based it somewhat on him, but probably Robert Redford was also floating around because I saw the movie in high school, and there's like, you know, just kind of that like blonde, you know, I don't know, very, very classical look.
And I love your portrayal of Myrtle's husband. He is so like weighed down and brutalized by the situation, and looks so disposable, and you know, just all the characters. And I remember in our conversation once you said that many graphic artists, they don't do even proper like facial features and things like that, but it was very important to you, right, to really bring out the characters.
Yeah, I mean Wilson was interesting because he's described in the book as being like gray and like, you know, I mean, all those things that you were describing, but also like a ghost. And I had actually wanted to draw him see-through.
Oh, how did you do that?
My editor and creative director were like, "That will confuse the reader."
I love the idea.
I know, but I mean, it's fair. Like, I think I tend to be a little bit more on the side of like, people will figure it out, or it doesn't really matter. But I think they were probably right that people would be confused as to why he would be see-through. But yeah, so that was a fun character too to do. And I like, sorry, I know I'm screen sharing so much, but
wonderful to see.
Are you seeing my screen now? Yeah. So this is me.
Oh, you act it out. I love that.
So if I'm having a hard time drawing a scene, I will act it out. So here on the left, I'm Myrtle. Upper right, I'm Owl Eyes. You know, lower right, I'm Daisy.
That's amazing.
My cigarette meaning a pencil.
You have an acting background?
No, I always loved acting when I was in like elementary school, but you know, there's only so much time for the arts, and I was clearly a drawer. But I mean, when you are a graphic novelist, you are the actor. You know, like you're every single character. And so I love drawing Tom, actually, because I just get up and I like, you know, puff out my chest and like, you know, widen my stance, and like, and same with like Jordan would be so fun, you know, to kind of like to do. So there's a lot of acting in making graphic novels, but you just have to do you just have to capture it in the one panel, you know, unlike your husband who, you know, is an actor and
yes,
he has to keep the character going.
Yeah. Oh, but that's fantastic. And do you take the photos yourself, or does your husband take the pictures of you doing the
I usually take them just on my computer, like on this camera.
Okay.
So, but sometimes if it's a weird angle,
Yeah.
I was looking through, and I should have included this, but there's me as a dead body in it. You know, where I have Mike taking a photo of me, and I'm all wrapped up in a blanket on the floor. And sometimes I make Mike do it, but it's hard because I have a very specific idea in my head, and I'm like, you're not doing it right. And so
oh, how wonderful. What amazing insight into the creative process. I just love that. And I guess talking about dead bodies, you know, and the ending of Gatsby, you know, you shared with us how you feel really quite angry at how Daisy was treated by both Tom and Gatsby, and, you know, the stalkerish nature of Gatsby himself. And yet you do seem to have some compassion for him at the end of the book, I feel, anyway. That was my interpretation, in the sense that it just feels so desolate. You know, you emphasize how abandoned he is by the world, and how lonely, and how no one comes to his funeral, and it just seems so desolate. And I wonder how you interpret the ending, whether you did have some sadness for him, whether there was some hope at the end. How do you see the ending?
Oh, I see it as very sad. And I think nobody coming to his funeral is just so heartbreaking, when he was so generous with his money and house, and like, I don't, and it also just the tragedy of it kind of being a mistake, right? Like, he wasn't driving the car. So I mean, it's this duality, right? Like, and I feel like I can both be very angry at Gatsby and, you know, and sympathize for him. And similarly with the book, it's like, you know, I can both be drawn to this beautiful world of wealth, but also see how horrible it can be, right? Like this whole thing about like what they leave behind, and sort of what that world is. And I think Fitzgerald is good about having those different things. Like, I mean, even within himself, he's pretty, you know, he's quite anti-Semitic, and his descriptions of Black people in the book are pretty bad, or like, and women, certainly, he's sexist, but he's also super judgmental of Tom, who's racist, and he shows him as the racism is not like glorified. It's kind of Tom being stupid. And so, you know, I feel like he contains a lot of these different dualities in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, you know, constant paradoxes, and I think you've brought that out really well in the drawings as well, that we have these conflicting emotions. Yeah. Hi, Elizabeth.
Chatting away.
Do you have any final questions you wanted to ask Virginia before we leap into audience questions?
I feel like that was a natural kind of conclusion, talking about the ending and so on. But, you know, I don't know if Catherine has anything particular, but I'm sure that the audience is bursting with questions that I haven't asked. So I don't want to take up any more airtime.
That's great.
Right. Well, I will mention again that these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Signed book plates are on their way as well for us to send out. I'm going to leap into some audience questions here. If you have any others, please do throw them into the chat sidebar or the Q&A panel. Mercedes says, thank you. I am starting to teach March, and I told them about your new work with Gatsby, and they wanted me to ask you how your imagination was influenced by your creative process, and how illustrating a book you love has altered your imagination as a reader. And her queer lit students are curious how you have captured Nick's queerness and how readers respond to that.
Yeah, so I'll go with the latter question first, because I think that's easier to address. So I did include this scene that I mentioned before with McGee, and I don't, in any part of the book, there's nothing explicit, like, you know, Myrtle and Tom just go off into a room together. And in this scene with Nick and McGee, you see kind of McGee in bed. He's, you know, in his underclothing. Nick is in the room, like, it's a shot over his shoulder. But like, I definitely had early readers be like, wait, what? like I didn't realize that when I read it in high school. So I think it's clear enough. I didn't include the elevator scene, Mercy, which, I mean, I had it in my earlier pencils, but my editors didn't feel like it related to my reading of the story, because my reading of the story wasn't about, like, so some people's reading of the story is that Nick is in love with Gatsby, and that was not my reading. I think he's it's a different kind of obsession. Like, I think he's very interested in him and kind of, you know, like, but I don't read it as love. So I didn't include kind of that part. But interestingly, recently, with Gatsby coming into the public domain, somebody found me on Twitter who wrote, I think, a self-published Gay Gatsby book, which sounded super fun. But he said that my version and his version were the only adaptations that have included the McGee scene. And so a lot of people on Twitter were like, oh my God, you included it, because most, I guess, cut it. So that's kind of how I took it. And then question is how it influenced my imagination. I mean, this is kind of how I viewed Gatsby in my head all along, but I found recently, like, I've never seen the Baz Luhrmann 2013 Gatsby film because I didn't want it to influence this strong picture I have in my imagination. And I thought about, in preparation for this, you know, book coming out, watching it, but I found that I still didn't want it to influence my interpretation. So I'm very careful with it. So I don't know if it's like how, I mean, I mean, essentially what the book is my imagination on the page. So I'm not sure how it's changed it. I'm not sure how I'd answer that.
That actually also answers Erica's question of, did you watch the new movie for any inspiration or rewatch the old one? You did mention that Robert Redford.
No, I think I saw that, you know, sophomore year of high school, and I haven't seen it since. I really am protective of my
really wise not to
my
see
visuals in my head of things that I.
Well, Jessica wants to know how many.
Yeah, my editor did go. Oh no.
I've got
Sorry, you cut out. I wasn't able to hear you. Jessica wants to know.
How many times did you read The Great Gatsby before you started creating your graphic novel? And how many times do you think you've read Gatsby at this point?
Yeah, I would have no idea, because it was a book that I reread every couple years, or maybe even every year. And then while reading the book, I certainly read it a couple of times just through. And then before doing any page or scene, I would reread it, and then I would reread it out loud to make sure I wasn't forgetting any details. So at this point, I have no idea. 25, I don't know.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Joseph says, there are pages where the text becomes part of the scenery. How did you arrive at that design? And how did you decide which text should be given that treatment?
Yes, so that was another thing that I did that, I'm gonna screen share this because it's easier to show. Sorry to make you guys watch all this. So this is the example where it's like in the clouds or on the shadows. And basically I decided to do that because I didn't want the text to weigh down the page. So I wanted to figure out a different way to make it feel lighter. But also the text I chose to do tended to be more snide remarks as opposed to straightforward, you know, narration. So like this one in the clouds, or Tom's absurd comment, they were kind of Nick's little snide notes. And that was somewhat from a cartoonist friend who recommended that to me.
Okay. Mary Beth says, what was it that focused you on the graphic novel as your artistic medium? Your illustrations are truly lovely and incredible. And then that also ties with Richard's question. It would be great to hear the names of some of your favorite graphic novels and how they've influenced you.
Sure. I came to graphic novels pretty late. I didn't read them growing up. I didn't really read comics. I did make comics as a kid that I've seen, you know, now going back, but I didn't like verbalize it as that. But I came to it after college when I read a book, Scott McCloud's Making Comics or Understanding Comics. And it just was, that's how my mind thinks. Like it is very verbal and like word focused, but it's also extremely visual and more visual than verbal. And I think the graphic novel medium is perfect for that. I did animation previously, but I think graphic novels are even more suited to me because I think I like the pacing and different things about it. And in terms of graphic novels that influenced me, my favorite thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris is really wonderful and has really unusual like panel borders and page spreads, and that kind of encouraged me to be a little more creative with that. So that's one that I keep coming back to again and again. Tilly Walden, I also really love her work, especially Are You Listening and Spinning. Also, again, I guess this is the theme, like interesting panel compositions, a little more surreal elements. Those are ones. And then The Prince and the Dressmaker is a really fabulous book of a different sort. And I'm sure Gibson's has many of these books because they have a really amazing graphic novel section. I was super impressed when I first went in because some stores just have, like the top 20 graphic novels. And I was really impressed that Gibson had, different sections for YA versus middle grade. And so you guys should go in and check them out.
I will let our children's buyer know your
Yes.
compliment. Daniel says, there was a trip to a car museum, the ballerinas in a swimming pool. Where else did your research for this book take you?
Well, the Breakers, which is a huge mansion in Newport. And that was the interior of the Breakers was my inspiration for the interior of Gatsby's house. So that was an important one. And also, I mean, less exciting in terms of where it takes you, but this book is well used. And this friend of mine who was writing a book set in the 1920s recommended it to me, and so a lot of inspiration from that book.
Okay. Let's see. Lindsay asks, what is your favorite detail of the story that you had to cut out of the final book? Which also actually ties with Erica's question, since this is an adaptation, how closely did you stick to the story, the dialogue of the original work? Did you change wordings?
I would change little wordings. I would try not to change the meaning, but sometimes like a tense had to be changed, or some things like that. Like I said, I sometimes had to add in a word or get rid of a word. But in terms of ones that I cut, I keep getting asked this and I can't remember now. I'm sure that there are. I was a much more brutal, like my editors were the ones who really wanted more text in it. And I was the one who was more saying no, because I wanted this lightness of Gatsby to be captured in the words. So that was that. But I can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember the two questions.
It was how did you change things as an adaptation to make it fit? It's a different medium. And you did mention earlier that there was a whole page of prose that you converted into a single image, and which is something that you can do with the visual medium. But then also, what was your favorite detail that you had to cut?
Right.
So let's see here. New questions for you. Drat, brunettes lost their chance for the spotlight again.
I know, look.
We're all brunettes here. Why? Let me see. There's a question here. What specifically drew you to The Great Gatsby?
I mean, the gorgeous visuals. Obviously, I'm an extremely visual person, so those were a very vivid picture in my head. But I've always been really interested in class, and I think similar to Fitzgerald, like I grew up well off by normal people standards, like very well off, but I was surrounded by people who were much more wealthy. I went to a private, kind of an elite private school. And so I was super conscious of class and wealth from a very young age. And I think that's what drew me to this book, and feeling a little bit like Nick, kind of in between worlds, and also like Fitzgerald had that too. So I think that was kind of what drew me. And I also really like well-paced stories. I think the pacing of Gatsby is really good. And I think it's a very tight story, which is also something I appreciate. I mean, it's really quite short, which was also appealing to me when adapting it, because I didn't want to I already had to cut so much. I didn't want to have to cut like 200 pages or something.
Joseph wants to know, do you work with typical editors, or are there editors that specialize in graphic novels?
My Candlewick is a children's book publisher, and which means kind of books for people under 18, and they don't specialize in graphic novels. They do a wide range of things, and graphic novels is one of them. So my editor did not specialize in them, but there are editors and graphic novel publishers that's what they do. And I also work with a lot of I get feedback from other cartoonists even before I send it to anyone to look at, to my editor. So I get their feedback first and then send it on.
Which is your favorite scene, and would you do another adaptation? Is there a particular story that might be possible as an adaptation in the future?
I am not really inclined to do another adaptation. Sorry, I'm going through these at this time. It was hard to do, and people are so have a lot of opinions about how an adaptation should be, when especially a classic book. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it, but I don't think it'll be the focus of my career. There are some excellent graphic novelists like Gareth Hines who mainly do adaptations, but I don't think that that's for me. But this is my favorite page. It's very near the end of the book, and it's the scene where Nick's talking about his experience in West Egg, and it was, again, this is one of those pages that are more unusual from a panel. There aren't any panel borders. It's very surreal, and there are a lot of details from the book that I was able to include if you're closely reading, and so I think that's always a fun thing. And then I know, Elizabeth, when we were talking before, you asked about the most challenging page, I think, right? Was that?
I did, yes.
This was the most challenging page. And I think it was challenging because of the color issues, because there were certain colors I couldn't use and wanted to use, like her house is described as white, Daisy's in white, I don't know what happened, but this all the versions of me trying to figure it out. And so these are little printouts of the page where I try different color variations. And then I would, I just didn't like a lot of them and just wasn't feeling it, and how it worked in the flow of the story. So this is how I get the flow. Another way I get the flow, Virginia, with color is I do these samples first on tiny size, and then go forward. So.
Is there a scene that you redid the most? That you would design it and be like, no, this isn't right, and you throw it out and you do it again and then again, and was there one that just confounded you?
I know chapter 4 was really hard for me. But I think it was more things that were going on in my personal life. Just happened to be when I was working on chapter 4 for penciling, and then later for inking, and then later for coloring. So that's the one that was just really challenging, but I don't know that I reworked it. I can't remember how much I had to rework it. My timeline was really tight, so I kind of didn't have a lot of leeway to rework it because of the public domain. We had a very tight timeline. But the scenes that scared me the most were the party scenes. Because as a cartoonist, you're just like, oh my God, that's so many people you have to draw, and they have to be fabulous and in 1920s clothing, and this, it's very hard. So.
Well, Joseph says he can't wait to get his copy, and it's a lovely book. How much research did you have? Well, you did hold up the fashion magazine to make sure that you got the makeup and the hair and the clothes right. How much time did you spend costuming your characters?
Costuming was a fair amount of time, but I also made the decision that I was everything in the book is not historically accurate. I was there's no way, as a graphic novelist, you have to do everything, like I said, with the acting, but you have to be the director, the cinematographer, the costume designer, the set designer. And I was just I can't also have this be historically accurate and not spend another year, on top. So I, would borrow things from the 1920s, 1930s, my own imagination. The car certainly is just an amalgamation of designs. So I also grew up watching a lot of BBC and like Bertie Wooster and Franny Fisher and Poirot. So I feel like there was some of it was just kind of sunk in from the 20s and 30s.
Well, Robin wants to know, how long a vacation are you taking now that the book is launched?
Yes.
Yeah, like none. I mean, I also finished the book, you know, January of last year. So it takes that long for, you know, it to get made. So
Margaret wants to know, have you been in touch with others during interpretations of The Great Gatsby? You did mention the gay Gatsby, like Michael Ferris Smith, the author of Nick, or did you get a chance to read it perhaps?
I haven't read Nick yet, but I have been in touch with the author, who's very nice, just to, you know, be like, oh, we both have this thing coming out. And I have been meaning to reach out. There's a Gatsby graphic novel that came out years ago in, I think, Australia and Canada, but everything's sea creatures, and I mean, it's completely different. There was another one that came out this summer from the Fitzgerald estate. So it's kind of an unfortunate thing as a, you know, also a business person to have all this competition, but maybe it'll also bring up more interest, and that's kind of the hope. And I've been in touch with somebody who did a illustration, Simon, shoot, I'm forgetting his last name, Anderson, but an illustrated version. So there are a lot of different ones.
So last audience question, then one from me. Michael says, what was your favorite part of the adaptation process?
I really like penciling, kind of having the story come to life for the first time, but not having to fixate on all the details and making it look perfect. Like I like the kind of speed and figuring it out and that problem solving. And then coloring is just so much fun because it's so beautiful and things come to life in a different. So I guess it's the coming to life, first with penciling and then later with coloring.
So the question that I will end us with is this meme was going around on the internet. And they said, with Gatsby joining the public domain, we need a Muppets adaptation of The Great Gatsby with one human character left. So who would you choose, do you think, to be the lone human character in a Muppets movie?
I mean, it would have to be Nick, I would think. Like, I can't think of somebody else because he is the one, like, somewhat sane person in this world. I don't know.
Nick is kind of like the not quite the straight man, but everything kind of bounces off and around him. So I agree. I was prepared to argue with you, but I'm glad that we agree.
What about Virginia?
With my extensive Muppets knowledge, I kind of thought maybe Gatsby, just because he's such an enigmatic character, and it's so difficult to pin him down. And he's so unreal. I just thought it would be quite funny to make him the human. I don't know, maybe ironic.
Well, it would be kind of funny to see a Muppet Gatsby, though, reaching his way.
It would be towards the light. Yeah, you're right.
This is the best ending to an event. I would like to thank both of you for joining us this evening, and thank you to our viewers at home. These books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. More signed book plates are on their way. Thank you so much, Virginia. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for joining us on your launch week. I hope that launching into a pandemic is not as stressful as it could be. So I'm so pleased that you joined us this evening. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Yes, thank you guys. It really means a lot to me that you're all here. I see all these names. It's wonderful. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Gibsons and Virginia.
It was an honor. It was an honor. This is really a beautiful book. Everyone go out and get it.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.